about you, but I grew up listening to AM radio in the 60s. WLS in Chicago. It was the backdrop of my life, and I was really keen from a very early age. When I was 6, I had a best friend, Rosie Miller, who happened to be Jewish, who was a couple of years older than me. She had an older sister, Carol. She was the epitome of a teenager in the early 60s. Her bedroom was a treasure land of exotic scents, mainly hairspray and perfume. And her hair was stacked in a bouffant, and curlers were there every other moment. And they were a necessary trial in order to achieve the heights that she did. Her room was also had the quintessential record player with a never-ending stack of 45s filling the apartment with the glories and the pain of love. The words from so many of the songs that are that era are permanently embedded in my brain space. Of course, it was years before I really comprehended what all the fuss was about, but I am sure that my concept of what love and marriage was, as it was for many of us whose main informant was pop music, was simple. You think a guy or a girl was cute, which was a big pursuit to look cute. You get them to kiss you, and then you get married, and your love would never die. Easy. The concept of two people with shared goals and value systems, building their lives and likely raising children towards a common purpose for the greater good, was completely missing. The radio version was all about me and my feelings and my happiness and my needs. This shallow notion does not and has not worked, as is plainly evident with our soaring divorce rate and serial cohabitations. Without vision, the people perish, says Proverbs 29:18. My needs and my happiness trump responsibility, perseverance, and self-control. Well, what is the answer? Covenant. Covenant is not conditional. It requires determination and hard work when feelings do not line up with your intentions. God knows that when we let feelings dictate our actions, we don't choose the discipline of working through challenges, and we actually end up losing our self-esteem. Our Creator knows better feelings emerge after being tried and thereby maturing. But it requires preferring others as Jesus taught us to do. When we covenant with God to be His, we, in one respect, covenant with all of humanity to bless and not curse, even when we are wounded. Learning to love God and each other is only achieved when we are stripped of the things that make us feel good. And yet there is no greater beauty than those who have discovered the deep wells of the love of God and still trust in His goodness, even in the face of searing loss and disappointment. My next guest, Wilma Derksen, is a pastor, an author, a therapist, an artist, and that's just to name a few. She is the recipient of the Order of Canada and is a shining example of the power of light triumphing over darkness and loving when experiencing unfathomable wounds. I have ascribed to her Proverbs 31, verse 30. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. What a privilege we have today to have Wilma Derksen in studio with us. Welcome, Wilma. It's just a joy to have you, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear more of your story.
Well, thank you for having me, Victoria. It's wonderful to be here.
Yes, well, and it's thunderstorming outside in Winnipeg today. We're all very happy about that. If you those of us who have gardens, and I know Wilma has a beautiful garden.
Yes.
Wilma, I just want to say that the verse I ascribed to you, I hesitated to ascribe it to you because you're still a very beautiful woman physically. But, and there's nothing wrong with seeking physical beauty. Try as we might when we're still in lockdown. We were just discussing we can't get haircuts or anything yet. But I believe that the verse means it isn't enough beauty alone, physical beauty, to weather life's storms. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm a bit of an artist, so I love beauty. I love charming people, and I think we can ascribe to that and want to be that. But you're right, there is something about those kind of shallow values that are seductive, but they don't last. And life doesn't allow us to be on top of our game all the time. And so that's when we need to look at God and to admire God's beauty, because what we admire, that's what we're going to ascribe to. And that's what lasts.
Wow.
So life isn't pretty.
Well, I was going to say that is just beautiful that when we look at God's beauty, that's what we ascribe to. That's a fridge magnet right there, I think. But many of our listeners may recall your story as it has been fairly high profile since 1985. But for those who don't, please share the events of the tragedy that your family encountered.
Well, our tragedy happened when our 13-year-old daughter, Candace, didn't come home from school one day, and it was just a panic. We knew almost immediately that she had been abducted or something like that because we just expected her to come in. And that led to a 7-week search for her, an intense search here in Winnipeg that was most overwhelming in some ways, their search for her. And then her body was found in a shack not that far from our place. Her hands and her feet had been hogtied, so we know it was a sexual torture scene. And the pain of that was just incredible.
Yes, we were moving to Winnipeg right around the time that Candace had gone missing. And my parents, who were living in the States at the time, had even read about this story from Winnipeg, and they were concerned. So certainly it caught the heart and concern of people all over the world, but especially here in Winnipeg. Most of us can't relate to a tragedy of this magnitude. What was your first response?
It was panic, just panic. And that's all we could think of was finding her, right? That was the beginning of it. And then the fear, and then the darkness, just the incredible darkness. It felt like a velvet, really heavy drape right against me, trying to push against it all the time. Everything became an effort. And just the pain. It was just incredible.
And how did your response sort of evolve over time? You described a little bit of that. But,
well, at first we were numb,
Yeah.
and then the anger, right?
Right.
And I just remember one friend coming and visiting me, and she says, "What would it take for there to be justice?" And I said, "Well, it wouldn't be enough for him to die because he was a man and she was a child. There's no equity in that." I didn't even know I believed in capital punishment at that time. And then I went down deep into my angry soul, and I said 10 child murderers would have to die. And I tried that, and it didn't satisfy me. And then I said I would have to shoot them myself. And I shot them in my mind's eye 10 times, 10 figures, and it felt delicious. I hate to admit that. I was deep in anger, and then when I saw the devastation, then I could pull out of it. But that's how deep and incredibly and hidden. It was hidden anger as well.
Yeah, what we find out about ourselves when we're in the pressure cooker, and yet, I think the beautiful thing is God's okay with that.
Yes.
He's not pointing a finger saying, "How dare you be so angry?" It's just good to acknowledge how devastated and what kind of reaction you would want to have.
And I even had to admit it before I could pull out of it.
Right.
So that was interesting anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. You can't change unless you identify this is what's going on. How did this affect your marriage and your children, your other children?
Well, marriage is a great stage to fight when something like this happens. And thank goodness, Cliff and I, in our premarital counseling, had got this advice that you don't blame anybody for something they can't change.
Wow.
And so
Very good
it's
advice.
so easy to blame the person close to you, because we often just blame somebody that's close, somebody that's safe, and somebody that we know very well and that has faults. So
that's not you, right?
No, that's your partners,
That's
right?
somebody else
And so our
entirely.
husbands and our partners are just ripe for all our blame, and that really is what destroys our marriages. And so we had to look out for that all the time. It just came up in the funniest little places. Well, they weren't always funny. And just constantly fighting that blame and saying, no, that we're in this together. But it wasn't easy.
Right, and your children, how did they respond to this?
Oh, they were amazing. They follow our lead. Very
Right.
much so.
Your children, in fact, are still serving the Lord, and your son is our pastor, for instance. So how was this a process as a family to say you've all seen evil firsthand and in graphic detail that has just ripped your hearts out? And yet, how did you lead the family into still saying the Lord is good?
Well, that was my biggest fear. After having lost Candace, I knew what it was like to lose one child physically. I didn't want to lose the other two, even emotionally or spiritually. So I was praying about that one day when I was driving down the highway. And then I stopped because there was a Canada goose mother with her goslings crossing the highway, and all of us stopped, and all of us had to pay respect to this mother. And then God says, or gave me the thought, she's leading the pack. You have to lead, and they will follow. So you have to find you can't expect your children to go through something that you haven't found your way through. So that was incredible motivation to say, okay, I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to lead my children in it. And so I had to, in some ways, involve them with everything. And my daughter to this day laughs, and she says, in our dinner table during that time, we always had these conversations about trauma. But she's laughing about it. And so we really involved them.
Good old days.
Yeah. But we involved them in it. And I think, where two or three are gathered, or four, like a family, if we're in it together, then God is in the midst of them. And I could see us being led and God leading them too in incredible different ways.
That is great advice for all parents of young children listening out there, I think. Not to avoid, but to lead how you process things. Wow. Now, we also know the story has not had full closure. Describe the effect of continuing to relive and rehearse what happened through various court trials.
Well, it happened after 20 years of obscurity and mystery that all of a sudden the trial, somebody was charged with the murder. And so then we found ourselves in the courtrooms, and that's incredibly intimidating and incredibly astounding to see everything again in that light of justice. But the part that was the most unsettling was the publicity around it. Here we were going through it all again, emotionally, and we do it all emotionally, at least I do, in the public eye. That was just so daunting, and I found that I just needed just to be who I was, in front of the public or in front of the camera or not. I couldn't hide it. And there's a blessing in it too. Just when we think something's really bad, and it's going to be a nightmare, another nightmare, we found that the publicity brought everybody to us, and we were just overwhelmed with, again, the support of the city. So even though it was, on one hand, I always think of it as just darkness again, just revisiting that dreadful drapes that just suffocated us, versus this beautiful light that people would just come over and we'd talk about and debrief it, and God's leading through this wilderness of trials that happened over 10 years and remains unsolved.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really something, isn't it? You have to ask yourself, why is that? But there is a purpose. We know God is good and can redeem all of this, but still doesn't mean it's not huge trial. But I was going to say, how does being a woman of the book, somebody who takes direction and inspiration from our scriptures, how does that affect how you walk through each challenge? I mean, I think you've already kind of alluded to that, but if you have a specific verse or Bible principle, maybe what's the most profound biblical principle that has helped you?
Well, ever since I was young, I see the Bible as a book of salvation, of course.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is our entry into a relationship with God and Jesus and all of that. But right from the beginning, I think I've always seen it also as a psychological guide. Mm-hmm. With a wonderful coach, with an amazing coach.
Better than Tony Robbins, or
yes, oh yes, oh yes. So ever since I think I was young, even in Bible school and all the time, I would meet these issues that I couldn't resolve. And I didn't go to the academic books. I went to the Bible, and I remember late at night, if I couldn't sleep, I would just flip it open and start reading. And read and read. One time I went almost, with one issue, I went through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was only when I was in Romans, I was skipping kind of, but it was only in Romans that I found the answer to that issue. Mm. So when this happened, I just remember going down into the basement when everybody was sleeping and just reading. And then finding that all of a sudden there will be a verse or some words that will just pop out of the Bible and hug me.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And that is how I think I still see the Bible as to study it. I love messages. I love every type of thing that they're always, no matter what kind of setting almost, it's those verses that come out and just hug.
Mm-hmm. It's living and active, isn't it?
It is.
It's not it's not just words on a page and ancient script. It's active. We know that from Scripture itself.
Yeah, it just has a spirit.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I'm so grateful that you have the Bible and a relationship with God and the Holy Spirit that has been able to give you the ability to walk through where most families, I think, would have found themselves in much greater tragedy. God has given you and your husband a platform to speak to others about forgiveness, and that's a pretty big key, I think. Many can't comprehend, why is this important? Why do we need to forgive? Or can you ever forgive somebody who has done something, especially to a child, your child? What would you say?
Well, the platform of forgiveness was not one that I would have chosen.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to go back to when Candace's body was found. It was a day that was just incredibly sorrowful, and we had friends again. Friends are terribly important in all this. We want to isolate ourselves, but friends are really important. And they just filled our house, and then at 10 o'clock they left, and there was another knock on the door, and a man was there, and he presented himself as a parent of a murdered child. And he says, "I've come to tell you what to expect." Then for 2 hours at the kitchen table, he told us the most horrific story of how the murder of his daughter had cost him his job, his concentration, his relationships, everything. And he even had heart trouble. And he says, "I've even lost the memory of my daughter." Well, when he left, we were, of course, stunned. And we were looking at what was lying ahead now in a new way. We thought it was only going to be grief. And then realized, no. Murder creates trauma. It creates all of that. So when Cliff and I went to bed that night, all of a sudden we looked at our bed. We couldn't enter it. There was something on our bed. The trauma that he had left centered in on our bed. So even though it was imaginary, it was real. We couldn't go to bed. And there wasn't any other beds around in the house. We just looked at each other. We were locked in with this fierce trauma that had become a reality. And then that night we said, we know there's an alternative. We don't know how it's going to work, but we're going to use the word forgiveness. And you know what? The thing moved. We slept that night. That's the first miracle of forgiveness.
Absolutely.
Then the next day in the press release conference, when we were thanking with the city of Winnipeg for everything they had done for us, all of a sudden one of the reporters said, "And what are you going to do about the offender? What are you going to do about the murderer?" Well, we said very dismissively, we're going to forgive. We were thinking only of the trauma. We weren't thinking of the person even. We hadn't even gone that far. We were too traumatized to go there. And the next day, it was all over the newspapers. So we had gained a kind of identity as a forgiving couple when we knew nothing about it. We didn't even know if it would apply to murder. We didn't even know how.
Right.
We just knew that it had moved the trauma off of our bed. And then we realized that nobody liked the word. Over 80% of Canada was against us in that they did not think that we should be permissive.
Right.
And so that began the platform that just we started to explore it. And you know what? It's full of miracles. We would do it all over again, just to choose that word at that right time, right in the beginning. It's not a done deal at that point. It's a walk.
Process.
It's a walk through all the valleys of life.
Yeah, it is. It goes against the flow, doesn't it, to forgive?
Yes.
For our society, and yet we know in our scriptures, in our book, that Jesus says, "If you don't forgive me, I will not." My Father in heaven will not forgive you. If you don't forgive others, that's what I mean to say. If you don't forgive each other, I will not forgive. And for most of us, that means somebody who cheesed me off, cut me off. I mean, there is traumas, level of hardships, but when it comes to this level of forgiveness, that's you're living through a test for all of us and leading in that way too, because I feel sometimes in society, when there's no forgiveness, and this is true when I struggle to forgive, it's a bottomless pit. It'll never be enough, no matter what the other person does, to try to make things right. If I haven't forgiven them, it's a bottomless pit. It'll never be enough. I'll need more, and it hurts us more than it hurts the other person. But what a way that God led you into that road. Even if you didn't know what the full road looked like, just saying, all I want is this trauma out of my bedroom, and forgiveness is the road to that. What a beautiful way he led you. Yeah. You continue to visit prisoners and share the love of God with them. What is the greatest challenge for them to hear about God's love?
Again, it's the whole issue of forgiveness. That issue of love first, justice second. And that's a whole big concept. And I just remember one time when we realized that storytelling was helpful for both the victim and offender. And so we would bring in storytellers into the prisons for them to talk about, because forgiveness is a process and it needs people, it needs stories to deal with it. And one time we had 3 storytellers in a room, about 100 inmates. And one of our storytellers went ballistic. She says, "I'm not going to forgive any of you." And she just gave it to them, blasted them. And I thought, okay, this is where we're going to have to call in the guards. And then the kingpin of the penitentiary got up, and he said, "That's our problem too. We don't forgive." So that's when they crossed over to each other and realized that the biggest issue that we have in victim and offender, in many ways, the victims of crime have much more in common with offenders than they do with the person with the wonderful lawns and big houses. Because it's the issue of, can we forgive these traumatic experiences? So that was where they had a great deal of trouble, is accepting God's forgiveness and each other's forgiveness and forgiving others. Huge.
And what have you taken from these visits yourself? What has been the benefit for you, or the lessons you've learned from the inmates, besides the one you just shared about forgiveness?
I need to go back to one situation where that explains it in a way. I was having trouble with forgiveness, and one of my colleagues said, "You know what, you need to come into prison and you need to talk to lifers. You need to express this to them." So I was in a room and we had this talk, and I told their story and they told me theirs. Now, this was my incredible enemy, and I was facing them. I was facing the 10 murderers that I wanted to kill at one point. And all of a sudden, they were there, and they were telling their stories to me. And it was a moment of truth when all of a sudden I realized I didn't want to kill any of them. I just wanted to hug them. Wow. Because their stories of pain, as they went and told me exactly what led up to the murder, was always moving, always showed humanity. And so it taught me about love, How to love. Not that we let go of justice. Love first, justice second.
Right.
We don't do justice first, we do love first, and then we do justice, but they do need to go together. I just want to quickly say that. Because love in itself is permissive, and justice in itself is abuse.
Right. That's
so you need
helpful.
both. You need both all the time, and it's that interchange and that interplay that makes it fascinating, where you always try to put love first, and then you say, okay, now why did you do that?
Right. And people are then free to admit maybe what's going on inside, instead of always having to have the defense to feel okay, like I have to keep this wall around me so I don't crumble. But if you know you're loved, then you're free to have weakness, because you have a safe place to land. That's wonderful. Just such inspiring. You would never have chosen this road, but what lessons you can have for others. Now, you and your husband are both artists. I know Cliff is sort of for a living more than you are, because you do so many other things. As I said before, she's an author and an artist and a counselor, and you're both pastors. But describe the ways you've seen art break through people where words alone can't.
Oh, I was thinking of Cliff and his breakthrough, and how art is a therapy, and then you take people along when they look at the art. But I remember one time when it was during the trial that I came to look in Cliff's studio to see what he was doing, and he was creating this sculpture of King David. And King David is Cliff's love. It's his mentor, his goal, his guide, his everything, and in the Bible. And so I was looking at it, and he'd put a telescope against. This was King David looking at through a telescope, mixing the metaphors, of course, right? Mixing up, and I says, "What is this about?" And he says, "Well, David is looking at Bathsheba." And I says, "What?" And that was exactly when we were learning that the suspect had been stalking Candace. So he wasn't even knowing what he was doing. He was just playing. And it was his king stalking Bathsheba. And realizing this isn't new, this is old, and it's just as horrible then as it was then. And God, the justice of that, but the reality of that, right? And in that came, he found his own forgiveness again in another way too. That we're human, and that even our kings and our everybody falls.
Absolutely. We're all capable. We're all capable if it weren't but God, and even with God, we're capable of doing things, but it isn't just the bad people, it's all of us. And we all need to forgive ourselves and to be repentant too, right?
Yes.
And that's a part of it.
Great big repentance.
Great big repentance. And thankfully, King David had a wise prophet who was able to point out to him, did you know that what this man did that you're so outraged about, that's what you did. What is true beauty in your own words?
For me, true beauty, I think, is transformation. I love it now that my garden is coming up, and it was dead, and now there's life. I see the transformation in people's thoughts and conversation. All of a sudden, the light goes on. I think when people walk into God's presence, there's always something that transforms. We gain new life. So I think it's in God's presence and in God's life. And it's just the beauty of change, that something beautiful can come out of something not so good, The recycling of life. That's beauty.
That is beauty. That is beauty. And you're beautiful, Wilma. And I know that part of your beauty is because of how you've been refined, and you can speak about things that we're not authorities to speak about, but you're showing us the way. I mentioned earlier that Wilma is an author and you have a new book. So we're going to put details about Wilma's new book on our website. I am just so grateful we've had this chance to get to know more about Wilma and her story and her family. And she has a website, so we'll again put the details of it up for you. And until next time, thank you, Wilma, and God bless you. Shalom. Thank you for watching this episode of Women of the Book. To find out more about our guest or the ministry of Bridges for Peace, please follow these links or visit our website at bridgesforpeace.com.